Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, the channel that looks at history, religion, and culture and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo, and that person on the other side of the planet, I mean screen, is Mike Pierce, apparently. And today we start a brand new series on the Crusades, which is kind of a touchy subject these days.
Yes. Back when I was alive, crusade was still a positive word. Politicians ran crusades against poverty or other social evils. My secular primary school talked about the Crusades as vaguely heroic, and even Christians weren't embarrassed to use the word crusade to refer to evangelistic campaigns. Think of Billy Graham crusades. Who would say that now? Church boys movement was called Crusaders, a bit like the Scouts, And at the Christian bookshop in Swansea was CLC, Christian Literature Crusade.
Wow.
Nobody would touch that term with a barge pole these days. How were the Crusades covered in your schooling, which obviously happened several centuries after my own? Was it kind of neutral?
Yeah. Well, I think growing up in a Christian home, I think honestly, we must not have talked about them very much because a lot of this material is news to me.
So
But
was it perhaps considered embarrassing?
oh no, I think that they were portrayed as, successful evangelistic missions. But
Seriously?
of course, well,
Ooh,
I think they were talked about in a positive light, yes.
okay.
But my point being that we didn't talk about them very much at all, the details of what happened, which when we look at what happened, you can see why somebody would want to skip over them.
Yes. Yes.
So, like you said, though, most people do not view the Crusades in a positive light anymore. So, do you think that that is due just to growing Western self-loathing?
I think that might be part of it, because even in my own schooling, I don't think the Christian aspect was stressed very much at all, because it wasn't a religious school in any sense. I think it was seen as heroic because it was a Western expedition. So, yes, the reversal there might be down to Western self loathing, but also I think the secularization in more recent decades has been much more aggressive. And so, the religious aspect has been fastened upon and quite rightly, as I think, considered really unfavorably, and is, in a sense, perhaps part of the case against Christianity. So I think that's some of what's going on, yes.
Right. So, maybe as we look at this first slide, there are some pretty big issues here, especially with this part, Deus vult, meaning God wills it. How is it that people ever came to think that there was something Christian about invading the Holy Land or attacking Muslim lands? Because you have to admit, it looks pretty grotesque from where we stand.
Yeah, it does look grotesque from where we stand. I think maybe the clue there is in the expression Holy Land, because it was associated with the beginnings of Christianity. And this was an age, frankly, more like the rest of human history than like us, which saw land and possession of land as totally fine for being bound up with religious ideas. So the fact that the Holy Land wasn't in Christian possession was at least potentially some kind of an offence. But I think I'd want to give three main answers to this that are kind of linked with one another. Firstly, the Christianity of the first 3 centuries spread entirely by persuasion. Now, in case anybody is in danger of thinking that's me idealizing, Firstly, it's not, because that is what happened. But in any case, even if you wanted to attribute the worst motives to them, they didn't have any choice because they were being persecuted, right? Everywhere, basically. So there wasn't really any other way to spread it. But that was stood on its head in the 4th and early 5th centuries. And for the long explanation of that, see our series End of the Early Church, which we made, it must be about a year ago now, I think, or nearly that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, we'll put the link up here, so you definitely want to click on that and go back and see what was going on there.
Yeah, that'll be to the first episode, and then viewers can simply follow on from there, because I think there were about 8 episodes in that, of
Yep.
which maybe the 6 are kind of essential to answering this point. Secondly, once that shift has been made so that Christianity, instead of being a calling out of the world to follow Christ, becomes a program for running society, once that shift has been made, any wars that such states as call themselves Christian get involved in will inevitably have religion invoked. And before you know it, religious war has become a thing, as the kids say.
Right. Right, but religious war had always been, a thing in Islam, hadn't it? I mean, from the beginning, it had been spread by conquest.
Yeah, starting in the 630s, it explodes out of the Arabian Peninsula and it is spread at the point of a sword. That's jihad. But going back to the Christian side of this thing, even by the dismal standards of Christian states, calling a crusade was a first. And for that, we need to look at the third point, which is that Islam had been encroaching into Christendom's space.
Now, you don't think that was the real reason for the crusade, though, do you?
Not really, no. I mean, the bottom line here is that the Holy Land had been in Muslim hands since 637 or 638. That is not then really a reason to call a crusade in 1095. That's 450 years.
Right. Okay, so to sort of dive into the episode here, we're going to be covering two main topics today, starting with the calling of the crusade and all of the context in which that happened, and then the actual crusade itself.
Yes, the crusade, like anything else, didn't get called on a whim or come out of thin air. We need to look at the real reasons for why and how this happened. So, to get a little background, let's take a look at this.
This map is a bit complicated.
Sadly, yes. So, we're going to satisfy ourselves with explaining just the parts of it that are most essential for our purposes.
And if you viewers haven't already, you probably need to go full screen here.
Yes, maybe even press pause for a moment so you can look at the stuff a little more closely. Okay, so this map is showing the changing balance of power between civilizations covering a 350-year period. So the darker color of whichever civilization in question it is what had been in its hands in 700, and the slightly fainter color is where it had got to by 1050. So to start with Western Christendom, Latin Christendom, that's in red. So in 700, that covers the Iberian Peninsula and France and up to the Rhine and Italy and the northern part of the eastern Adriatic coast and the British Isles, notionally, to some extent, in fact. Okay, by 1050, loads of the German tribes and the Scandinavians and chunks of Central Europe had come into the Latin fold. Okay, to attend to the eastern half of Christendom, the Orthodox, the Greek world, that is essentially coterminous with the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. And that's in dark purple in 700. By 1050, it had lost a bunch of territory in the east to Islam. It had expanded marginally in the area around the Danube, just to the north of the Byzantine Empire, and more importantly, in Kievan Rus, which is that large lilac-coloured splodge well to the north. And then we're going to consider Islam here, which is the green shaded area. And as we've said, that comes out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s, and Muhammad dying in 632, and rapidly conquered all of the Levant, so the eastern end of the Mediterranean, what we now call Israel and Syria and Lebanon, from the Byzantines, and then spread east to take over the Persian Empire, and then rapidly west along the coast of North Africa. In fact, well before 1050, there were Muslim rulers over an awful lot of Spain. So that's going to have to do us for now. Yeah.
So basically, the Muslims took over a ton of territory in this span of years.
Yes, yes. It spread extremely rapidly, and as I've said, by warfare, by conquest.
Right. And so another important point here, I think you mentioned earlier, that Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for over 4.5 centuries at the point that the Crusade was called.
Yeah, which is why it's not the actual cause. I used to set essays on the Crusades to my Western Civ classes for college freshmen, and this was constantly invoked as a cause, because for them, 4.5 centuries in the dim and distant past is as nothing, right? In the uneducated mind, the entirety of the human past is all kind of conflated as one gigantic old days, whereas the correct mental procedure with all of these things is to say, okay, if there's a gap here of, in this case, 450 years, what is 450 years ago from right now as we're talking?
Yeah.
Right? And we get to, what, 1576. So, nobody's going to make war now to right wrongs, real or imagined, perpetrated in 1576. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, let's take a look at another map now that we need to consider before we get to the point where we can understand what the Pope thinks he's doing by calling a crusade. And that's this one.
Now, the red lines on this map are strictly modern frontiers, and that's to help orient us. So maybe you better explain who were the Seljuk Turks.
Well, the Seljuk Turks are simply one political dynasty of Turks. The Turkic people were, I was going to use the ridiculous word originally. Of course, there is no originally in history.
Right.
Far back as we know about, located in Central Asia, which, by the way, most of them still are. The large majority, I think all but one of the stans, the Central Asian republics of what used to be the Soviet Union, have Turkic languages. And
Right.
in the, I think it's the 8th and 9th centuries, a whole load of them moved south into the Persian Empire, taking up service as mercenary soldiers and becoming Muslims in the process, and gradually drifting westwards until they start to bump into the eastern frontiers of the Byzantine Empire. Well, by 1000 AD, they've got a large state of their own, and that's the dark grey shaded area we see there. Okay, another map.
Yes, and for this one, an important reminder is that Byzantium is our modern term for what at the time everybody called the Roman Empire, and that was the eastern half that had survived the barbarian invasion 600 years earlier.
Yes, the Western Roman Empire had collapsed entirely to barbarians. The Eastern Roman Empire had pretty much held the line. Yes, they still called themselves the Romans, even though they spoke Greek, not Latin.
Yeah, and even though it didn't include Rome, so that's kind of crazy.
Yes, yes. But it wasn't just they themselves that called themselves this, their neighbors referred to them that way as well. So by the late 11th century, they're coming under serious military pressure from the Turks. And their worst defeat was in the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which is indicated here. It's just at the very tip of the long red arrow. So we've got green arrows showing Turkish pressure coming into Anatolia, and red arrows showing unsuccessful Byzantine attempts to keep them out. And here we've got a much, much later depiction of the battle, which we can take as seriously or perhaps unseriously as we like. And here, almost our final map, for now anyway, we have the Seljuk Empire as it was in 1092, so just before Crusade was called. So it includes the Holy Land and the large majority of Anatolia.
Yeah, so they're covering a lot of ground here, but what's that splodge of yellow that's right in the middle of Anatolia?
It is Armenia, not where Armenia is today, of course.
And they're Christians, so they're surrounded by a Muslim Turkish empire.
Yes, but we need to make sure that our imagining of this situation isn't simply dominated by that map and the political government realities. The Turks had only recently conquered the rest of Anatolia, so much of the population there will still have been Greek speaking and Christian, but living under Muslim Turkish rule. And even in the early 20th century, there was still plenty of them left.
And one more illustration on this point, and from this picture, I think we can tell you've been up to your high tech wizardry again.
Yes, don't rub it in too hard. Yeah, best I could do, I'm afraid. But it is a pretty important sort of graph to look at. So it's showing the percentage of the population that was Christian in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine from around the year 600, when it will have been virtually 100%, down to around the year 2000. Now, even though the decline looks precipitate, it's spread out over quite a few centuries. So, given that the Muslim Arabs, in the first instance, conquer the region in the 630s, about 30% of the population, perhaps a little more, 31, 32%, is still Christian at the time that the Crusade is called. So the process of Islamization is gradual, right? A lot of people tend to think that when Muslims invaded, they simply forcibly converted everybody to Islam at the point of a sword. That did occasionally happen, but in the overwhelming majority of cases, it didn't. But the second class status of non Muslims in Muslim ruled states, in view of things like legal disadvantages, the right to carry weapons, being required to dress differently, and the jizya, the head tax that had to be paid by non Muslims. All this had the effect of driving down the non Muslim population because the advantages were always with converting to Islam. Now, that wasn't dramatic within one generation, but over centuries, the effect was dramatic.
Right.
Okay, well, one more map, and this is showing Europe around the year 1100. Now, terminology of states is highly contestable, and degrees of sovereignty of particular political entities can be shown, but if they are all shown, it results in a very confusing map. Or, as here, they can not be shown, and the map resulting from it is simplistic, which this one is. So this is one of the less misleading, although it is simplified.
Right. So basically, we're saying this map is the least worst option.
Yes, it means we can get through the explanations in a bearable time so we can all go home.
Well,
So,
it's serving a purpose then.
yeah. Okay, so just to go through this as quickly as we can, easily, the biggest political entity on the continent is the so called Holy Roman Empire, which is not the Roman Empire. It is a German empire, originally the eastern half of what had been the Frankish Empire established by Charlemagne in 800. So, pretty much all of what we now consider Germany and the Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia, and Austria and Switzerland, and the eastern side of what we now call France. You can see that what's left as France is rather anorexic looking by our expectations of today. And northern Italy, although you can just about see there that the papal states are under imperial domination, but they are actually governed directly by the Pope and will be down to the 1860s, actually. In the south, you've got the Kingdom of Sicily. In the Iberian Peninsula, you've got the very, very slowly retreating areas of Muslim rule and the very, very slowly advancing collection of Christian states in the north and especially the northwest. We've got England under the rule of Norman French conquerors from 1066 onwards. Wales is shown there as one entity. It's not. It's several different kingdoms. Most of Scotland has now been something like united under the Scotii, an Irish tribe that had come there in the 5th century. And Ireland, well, Ireland was a whole load of different petty kingdoms rather than one unit is shown there. It was essentially the Afghanistan of Europe. Nobody really controlled Ireland, least of all the Irish. And then we've got a very large Hungarian kingdom in the middle and east there. So Croatia had joined with Hungary as a result of dynastic marriages. And there in the southeast, we've got the Byzantine Empire. Yeah, that is about it. Okay, I think we can probably give maps a break now.
Everybody breathes a sigh of relief.
Woo! Yes. Okay, so here we've got Urban II, who was Pope from 1088 onwards, and he was born in France, made a cardinal by Gregory VII, but he was being kept out of Rome by Henry IV's appointee, the anti-pope Clement III, down to 1097.
Okay, now Gregory VII was a previous pope, and we're going to say more about him in a minute. But who was Henry IV, and what in the world is an anti-pope?
Right. Well, Henry IV was the emperor, basically, of Germany. So he's something like an overlord over northern and central Italy. And he didn't like Urban, which is why Urban is based not in Rome, but in France. And he's French himself, and he has the support of the French king. and an anti-pope. Yeah, does an anti-pope bear the same relation to the Pope as the Antichrist does to Jesus? No, the reality is that exactly who is Pope has been highly contested at various points in the past. And the person who, in the judgment of later history, counts as the real Pope is the Pope, and his rivals are then deemed to be anti-popes, regardless of how things looked at the time. On this point, I want to strongly recommend this book, J.N.D. Kelly, The Oxford Dictionary of Popes. Like, who knew? It's not particularly fat, and it's not particularly expensive, and it gives little potted entries depending on how important the Pope was or how long he was Pope for, which might range up to 3 or 4 pages and might be as little as half a page. You can see it's arranged like in columns, like the Bible, 2 columns per page. And that gives you the whole lot in chronological order, anti-popes included.
I've always been impressed by your knowledge of the popes. Now we know your secret.
Well, that is the secret, yeah. Okay, so Urban II is the one who preaches the First Crusade and calls for it at Clermont in France in 1095. So here we've got an illustration of this with typical late medieval Western art where ticker tape does the work of what balloons do in modern cartoons. And we've got a record of what he said. So here he is calling the crusade at the Council of Clermont. Most beloved brethren because the council consists of fellow bishops and archbishops and so on. Urged by necessity, I, Urban, by the permission of God, chief bishop and prelate over the whole world, have come into these parts as an ambassador.
Sorry, this bit over the whole world that he's claiming power over, that's a tad unrealistic, isn't it? I mean, in reality, his authority extends only over Western Europe.
Yeah, and not really very effectually over that. I mean, he's being kept out of the city of Rome before we can think of anything else at all. Yes, but this is the kind of ecclesiastical authority that the papacy claimed for itself because they are the vicars of Christ, right? Peter is the vicar of Christ and they are the descendants of Peter in papal theory.
Right.
Historical fact is another story entirely, and we can't go there now. Okay, so I've come into these parts, France, as an ambassador with a divine admonition to you, the servants of God. You are called shepherds. See that you do not act as hirelings. If anyone hates peace, how can he make others peaceable? That's a very reasonable question as he's about to declare war, but there we go. Keep the church and the clergy in all its grades entirely free from the secular power. We'll say a lot more about this in a moment, but there was a big struggle going on between church and state at this time. So make sure that the church is not subjected to secular rulers. See that the tithes that belong to God are faithfully paid from all the produce of the land. Let them not be sold or withheld. Now, tithes were a tax that people had to pay for the upkeep of the church. Then the Pope said that in another part of the world, Christianity was suffering from a state of affairs that was worse than the one just mentioned. He continued, "For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. For, as the most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania." By that he means the land of the Romans, not what we mean by Romania. So the Greek Empire, Byzantium, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean, which they'd reached in the 630s, right? And the Hellespont, that is the shore immediately opposite Constantinople, which is called the Arm of St. George. They've occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus far for a while with impunity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. I say this to those who are present. It is meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it.
Wow. Christ commands it. That's outrageous.
I suppose if you think Peter is the vicar of Christ and that you are the vicar of Peter, maybe your command becomes Christ's command. But it's still pretty horrifying. Yeah, the conclusion doesn't follow because I would contend that the premise doesn't stand. Yes. Okay. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins.
Now, this is interesting. Immediate remission of sins as a reward for something you did, and something violent at that. I mean, this kind of sounds like pretty appalling theology.
Yeah, it is appalling theology. Right. I think we can safely say that the kind of stuff that is said, not simply on your reading of the New Testament or mine, but everything we know from the early church fathers has been well and truly stood on its head here. Yes. This is tribal religion, pure and simple. By the way, this promise that everybody participating in the crusade will have plenary forgiveness of sins and that the Pope has the power to grant that, this would continue to be taught even beyond the crusading era. So a number of people protested that they wanted to go on crusade, but that they couldn't because they had to look after their peasants or their lands or something like that. Something was standing in the way. And they were later told, well, if you contribute funds to those who are going, you can enjoy the same spiritual benefits. And that then is further degraded over the following centuries for anything that the papacy was raising funds for. And this has its echoes even in 1517, at the beginnings of the Reformation. Remember that Friar Tetzel going around selling indulgences, to whom Luther objected, and that's where the Reformation kicks off, right? What was he selling indulgences for? In this case, for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, raising money for it. So, yeah, the whole process starts here. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. Whosoever sins ye forgive, they are forgiven. Whosoever sins ye retain, they are retained. John 20:23. Right? Now, there's an awful lot that we said about that and how we're supposed to understand that verse, but it is understood by the Catholic Church, at least in this era, as meaning that the Pope, being the descendant of Peter, could make this decision to forgive sins. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race, which worships demons, should conquer a people which has the faith of omnipotent God and is made glorious with the name of Christ. Let those who've been accustomed unjustly to wage private warfare against the faithful. This is warfare among barons in France in particular, which was a curse of the age. Let them now go against the infidels and end with victory this war which should have been begun long ago. Let those who have for a long time been robbers now become knights. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward.
So basically, you're already fighting amongst yourselves and other people. You might as well go and be productive.
Yes, it's diversionary, diverting people's violent energies. Okay, so why call this crusade? Firstly, it's about asserting papal secular authority. Now, to explain this, we need to lean back into history a bit, and we're not going to show any more slides about it because it would take too long and take us too far out of the way. But as briefly as I can, Urban is saying this in 1095 at the end of the 11th century, right? In the 10th century, the papacy had become really seriously degraded. It had lost almost all spiritual authority and indeed secular authority. If you look in Kelly's Dictionary of Popes, you will see that there was a rapid succession of popes, almost all of whom were too young and, in terms of character, totally unfit to be pope. Seriously immoral people, murderers, loads of popes ended up being assassinated. The papacy was the plaything of the aristocrats of the city of Rome. And when I say the city of Rome, I want to emphasize that the population of the city at the time was between 10,000 and 20,000. That is 1 to 2% of what the city of Rome had been at its height at the time of the Roman Empire. So if you want to visualize Rome in this period, you need to think of, by our standards at least, a small town of people living amongst ruins. Okay. So the papacy had been the plaything of the aristocrats of that city in their duels with one another. And it's often referred to, that period, the 10th century, as the pornocracy of the papacy. And we won't delay ourselves by looking at any of the details of that, but you can get the general idea by flicking through the relevant pages in Kelly. Well, from there, the only route was upward, and a reforming party cohered in the 11th century, whose guiding genius was a man called Hildebrand. Now, he wasn't really campaigning for himself to be made pope, but he was absolutely determined that the papacy would be spiritually reformed, administratively and financially more secure, and would not be the plaything of secular powers and politicians. Eventually, he himself was made pope, Gregory VII, and he's one of the 5 or 6 most important popes throughout the history of the papacy. So he is succeeded by others who are wanting to move in the same direction, and Urban is one of them.
So it sounds like papal authority had been at a low ebb, and so the popes were, sort of keen to reassert it.
Yes, there had been really serious power clashes between Gregory VII and the German emperors, and that's continuing into this era. And that is what is reflected in the fact that Urban is not recognized by Henry IV. Right, Henry IV wants to install his own man there. So this battle is ongoing. So the calling of the crusade is, most importantly, an attempt to assert papal secular authority. The idea that the Pope not only should be free from secular monarchs, but actually should have authority over them. And it's also wanting to underscore the centrality of the papacy in Western Christendom. Nobody else could call such a mission as this. No king, not even the German emperor, could call this. Only the Pope could even conceivably do it. So let's do it. But as we've already noted, it's partly a diversionary outlet for endemic violence among the minor nobility, especially in France. And finally, it's an attempt to undo the schism of 1054 by rescuing the Orthodox East from Muslim military pressure, thereby making Constantinople beholden to Rome.
Right, and the schism of 1054 was that formal separation between the Latin Catholic West and the Greek Orthodox East.
Yes, the two halves had been drifting apart for several centuries, well, maybe about 5 centuries, but it's formalized in 1054. They kind of anathematize one another. So 1054 is a kind of convenient mental coat hook to hang that on, right? That's when it finally happens. But as the calling of the crusade itself illustrates, they don't lose all fellow feeling for one another even after that. And so what he's wanting to do is, if possible, get that schism undone, reunited, but of course on Western Latin terms, because the Westerners are going to be the cavalry riding to the rescue.
Right. Now, this is funny because politically, these are really good reasons, whereas, that we were just looking at a few minutes ago seemed kind of weak.
Well, yeah, only the third of those is really reflected in what he's saying. But the first,
Right.
the second, and the fourth are awfully important. They're the
Yeah.
unspoken real agenda here. Yes.
Yeah.
But of course, this doesn't answer why so many people should have responded and gone on crusade, because many, many thousands of ordinary people did. Why become a crusader? Well, firstly, to have one's sins forgiven. People really believed this. They believed that Holy Mother Church had the power to forgive their sins. And people are also, of course, interested in engaging in warfare and plunder with the full blessing of Holy Mother Church. What's not to like?
Right.
Now, sitting where we do in 2026, this looks completely absurd. That's not what Christianity is about. Although we covered this a little bit in an episode a few months ago, the Crusader symbolism is being used again by certain Christian nationalist forces and high profile individuals in the US.
Right. That's right.
Right? So it's not then so hard to imagine it. We can deplore it, but it shouldn't be beyond the bounds of our ability to encompass mentally, because in a sense, it's right in front of us now. But also, we should mention, particularly in respect of people who were nobles, whether major or minor, they had the opportunity to seize lands in the Orient and to make themselves much more important landowners than they were at the outset. And remember, medieval society is entirely based upon holding of land. That is wealth by definition. For us, it's only
Right.
one measure of possible wealth, and maybe not the most important. But for them, that is it. We can consider feudal society to be a kind of pyramid landholding scheme, if you like. So here it is for the taking, and Holy Mother Church says, yay, so let's do it.
Right. Yeah, and the easiest way to get more land is to grab it from someone else.
Right, right. Well, you kind of have to, as my father said to me when I was still a teenager, get land, they've stopped making it.
Yeah. Right.
So first we've got a grisly prelude, Peter the Hermit and the People's Crusade.
Okay, so this was a kind of crusade before the crusade.
Yes, calling crusade is relatively easy. Getting everybody to coordinate and make it happen, much harder. And
Right.
loads of people came together enthusiastically and simply went off to the Holy Land woefully ill-equipped. And the unarmed lot got way ahead of the serious military. So around 40,000 people most of them ordinary men and women, gathered from what we'd call northeastern France and the Rhineland around Cologne in April 1096. But as they're gathering and before they're leaving, there are serious massacres of Jews in the Rhineland, especially in the city of Mainz.
Now, this is something we touch on in the second episode of our very first series about the Jews in Israel. So, please do go back and have a look at that.
Yes, please do. The numbers of people killed are not absolutely known, but somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 Jews in a number of cities. But as I say, Mainz was particularly bad. Part of the rationale was we're going off to the Holy Land to fight unbelievers, and we have these Jews in our midst, so let's have a go at them first. But closely alongside that was an attempt to grab their money. Because Jews were excluded from landholding in a society that was based on landholding, and they couldn't work in the church by definition and wouldn't want to, right? What did that leave? That left trade, and in particular, dealing with money. So a number of them, at least, became fairly wealthy, and that made them an easy target in circumstances like this. And so, yeah, there were some nasty pogroms. Well, on the march heading southeast, they went through Hungary, and there was some confused bargaining with border patrols in the south of the Kingdom of Hungary, which is in an area that today would be considered northern Serbia. And there was a riot and killing about 4,000 Hungarians in Zemun, which is just north of the Danube from Belgrade. In late June, Belgrade was burned and pillaged, and heading further south to Niš in southern Serbia, that city was stormed as well. But while all this is going on, a lot of the poorest pilgrims ran out of means to keep themselves going and starved, or were captured by Balkan locals and made slaves. So the crowd is thinning down. Going through Bulgaria, a quarter of the fighting men were killed by Byzantine troops.
So, all of these disasters are happening while still on Christian territory. They haven't even made it to Muslim lands yet.
Right, yes. Well, it's just been called. It's been done without the consent of the peoples or the rulers of the lands through which they're passing. And in any case, the further southeast you get, you're getting into Orthodox territory. So this will all have been news to them. And these people have got to be fed. I mean, this was the curse of warfare right up to recent times, actually, that you're moving large numbers of people around and they've got to eat. And the means for moving food around in large quantities and quickly simply is not there. So they're going to take it from the territories they pass through. And that's going to be so much the worse for the local inhabitants. So, yeah, that's how this is going. Well, around 30,000 people reached Constantinople at the end of July 1096. And the Emperor Alexios was not in the least pleased to see them, because these were a whole load of unruly people whom he'd now got to feed, and they had apparently come to help him, but he wasn't sure whether they really could be or would be of much help. He shipped them across the Bosphorus, as much to get rid of them as to help them on their way, but warned them not to venture very far beyond the shoreline because they'd get into Turkish territory. But they did anyway, and most of them were killed by the Turks.
So, the People's Crusade here essentially achieves nothing, except for all these people dying.
Yes, yes, that is pretty much it. One of the few survivors was this man depicted here, Peter the Hermit, who had called it or led it. He survived the final disaster, slipping back into Constantinople. And he waited there and joined up with the main crusade when it arrived a bit later. But yeah, the vast majority of people who embarked on this were simply slaughtered without making any impact on Muslim territory whatsoever.
Right.
And this is kind of like a portent for some of the future of crusading, actually. Okay, well, we are now going to need to look at another few maps, I'm afraid, so we can get an idea of what's going on and how. And this one shows the routes of the First Crusade.
So, although the Crusaders are coming from many places, it looks like the bulk of them are coming from France.
Yes, and they referred to themselves frequently as the Franks and were referred to as Franks by their enemies. Now, the Franks had been a Germanic tribe that invaded Roman Gaul in the 5th century and slowly expanded to cover all of it and turn it into France. It's kind of significant that here we are, 600 years later, and they're still conceiving of themselves in some sense as Franks and being identified that way. Yes.
Right.
But it was kind of a shorthand, particularly by non Westerners, for barbarian Westerners. And that is a fair enough judgment because you'd have to say that these people were mostly more barbarous than those through whose lands they were traveling and whose lands they were attacking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so they cross the Bosphorus and get into Anatolia. And this shows the political situation in 1097 by the time the Crusaders get there. So they win battles at Nicaea and Dorylaeum. And we notice the kind of splodge of Christian held territory that's Armenian Cilicia. The Danishmends, by the way, are a rival group of Muslim Turks, so non Seljuk Turks, who did fight against the Crusaders. So the Armenians, friendly, although cautious, because of course, whether the crusade succeeds or fails, they've got to live with all of these people after it's all over. The final map here shows the route down through the Levant towards Jerusalem.
So, the Crusaders were militarily very successful, it seems, because, I mean, they fought their way right through to Jerusalem.
Yeah, the First Crusade was by far the most successful of the Crusades. And as will be seen in later episodes, the others didn't do nearly as well. Apart from the First Crusade, only the Third Crusade achieved very much at all, and the others were all either partial or total failures.
Right. But as we're about to see, even success was pretty savage.
Absolutely savage, yes. They did manage to get to Jerusalem partly because of incompetence by local Muslim commanders. But they were extremely rash in breaking through to Jerusalem because they didn't hold all of the territory behind them. So they were incredibly exposed. They just decided to make a dash for Jerusalem itself, regardless of consequences. And amazingly, they did succeed. So here we've got a fairly modern depiction of the fall of Jerusalem on 15th July 1099. Well, here is an account taken from a book we're going to recommend in just a moment by Asbridge on the First Crusade. But a lot of what he has to say is, in fact, quotation from contemporary sources. So, some 4 kilometers long, up to 15 meters high, and 3 meters thick, Jerusalem's main walls presented a prodigious obstacle to any attacker. And there was quite a lot of maneuvering through June and July to try and get around this problem or to break through it somehow. And we can't delay ourselves with all the military details around that, but anybody who's interested in military stuff can get it all in Asbridge. It's there. So after successfully breaching the walls, Provençal crusader Raymond of Aguillet joyfully reported one could see marvellous works. Some of the pagans were mercifully beheaded, others pierced by arrows plunged from towers, and yet others, tortured for a long time, were burned to death in searing flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet lay in the houses and streets, and men and knights were running to and fro over corpses. One Latin eyewitness remembered how all the defenders fled along the walls and through the city, and our men went after them, killing them and cutting them down as far as Solomon's temple, where there was such a massacre that our men were wading up to their ankles in enemy blood.
Wow. This is pretty shocking for us to read. And while I always think it's important to remember that, people in those days probably had a different relationship with death and war, even still, something inside of us really screams out that this kind of butchering is just not right.
Right, yes. And least of all, in the name of Christianity.
Right.
But in a sense, the pass on that one has been sold back in the 4th and early 5th centuries once you've decided to make an alliance with the state and talk in terms of Christian countries. Once you've done that, all the rest is going to follow. And here it is in full spate. Yes. Yeah. Some prisoners were taken. Indeed, Tancred and Gaston of Béarn reportedly gave their banners to a group huddled on the roof of the Temple of Solomon. But even these were later slaughtered by other crusaders. Of Jerusalem's Muslim inhabitants, few other than the Fatimid commander and the remnants of the elite Egyptian cavalry force seem to have survived the general carnage. They managed to sneak out of the city, actually. I should say, by the way, that there was a substantial Christian population of the city, but they had been expelled by the Muslim commander before the siege began. I doubt it was exactly out of mercy, but perhaps because he feared that it would only need one of them to secretly side with the Crusaders to somehow let somebody in through a gate, and then that would be it. The Jews in the city were actually burned alive in their synagogue. So the whole thing is just utterly horrendous. In the minds of the Crusaders, religious fervour, barbaric warfare, and a self-serving desire for material gain were not mutually exclusive experiences, but could all exist entwined in the same time and space. In a moment that is perhaps the most vivid distillation of the crusading experience, they came, still covered in their enemy's blood, weighed down with booty, quote, rejoicing and weeping from excessive gladness to worship at the sepulchre, that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of our Saviour Jesus. Which is enough to make you vomit, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Now, I know you've just mentioned the use of violence to protect the Christian state, but even so, how did they combine religious piety with savagery and pillaging?
Well, Christianity may have been set up as being about forgiveness, not just from God, but of one another, and self-denial and meekness. But even today, we see not only how that runs up against people's atavistic tendencies, but is even engulfed by it. So religion as combat gear, the reason I am right and you wrong. And instead of undermining the our group versus your group dynamic, it gets instrumentalized to serve that dynamic. people willingly invoke God to underpin material gain, say by justifying slavery or segregation or the poverty of the poor, but even in a very personal way, such as health and wealth teaching in our time. So Christianity, properly understood, should make us a completely different kind of person, but it is perfectly capable of being subverted internally and weaponized. And we see that going on, including today, in terms of
Right.
things like Christian nationalism, for example.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's not such a huge leap in our imagination to see what that would look like in the late 11th century.
Yeah, and it becomes such a powerful argument precisely because God, or just God, is the ultimate court of moral authority. So it's almost irresistible to invoke religious belief in our quarrels with one another.
And so religiosity and depravity often end up going hand in hand. And again, we see
Right.
that, albeit in slightly different forms, in our own day.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, it's a huge warning to all of us. Yeah.
Yeah. And even, a convenient excuse. It's easy to say, well, God made me do it,
Right.
but in the end, I get what I want.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly it. So just take that and then magnify it to the power of n, and here you are, Jerusalem 1099. Yeah.
Right.
Well, having captured Jerusalem, they then want to hold it, and they establish Crusader states. So this map, and yes, it's the last one, but we are near the end now. This shows the states as they stood in 1100. So at the top right there, so in the northeast, is the county of Edessa, or most of it. The faint pink is the Armenians again, who've been there before. Okay, so the county of Edessa. Then the dark red one is Antioch. The purplish sliver, which is close to what we'd call Lebanon, is Tripoli. And then the pale yellow is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the permanent or remaining Crusader population was quite small, perhaps 200,000 people or 15% of the population. If that seems very strange, we immediately want to ask, well, how did they manage to hold it then? Just remember that at the time of the barbarian invasions of the Western Roman Empire, the barbarians were, except in England, seldom more than 15% of the population. So it could be
Right.
done.
Now, the conclusion, though, is what happens so often in war, isn't it? In that you achieve some military goal, but then they can't really sustain it during the peace that follows.
Right. And in the next episode, we're going to be looking at how those states came under serious pressure. And Second and Third Crusades were called to try and relieve that pressure. Yeah, politics, economics, and demography triumph over the military in the medium and long term, or at least military gains only become permanent if they can be followed up by economic and cultural changes afterwards.
Right.
Well, we should finish by recommending a couple of books. This one is Thomas Asbridge's book from 2003, The First Crusade, and it was his text that we were using just a few minutes ago in his description of the fall of Jerusalem. And this one is a classic covering the Crusades as a whole. Rather elderly now, but it's remained in print since the 1950s because it's so beautifully written. Just a history of the Crusades. Very widely respected. His judgment of them is that they were nothing more than a long act of intolerance in the name of God, which is a sin against the Holy Ghost. A judgment we might want to endorse.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, do you feel better now that you've recommended a couple of books?
Yes, I felt we needed to get that off my chest.
Oh, right. Well, I think that'll do it for today. But hopefully, you guys enjoyed that episode. Maybe learned something new about the Crusades. I certainly did. And if you did enjoy it, we would love it if you would share this episode, send it to some friends, send it to some people who romanticize the Crusades a little too much, anything like that.
Definitely those. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Yes, please do repost it as widely as possible. Thank you, and bye bye now.
Bye, everyone.